Hey everyone, today I'm here with Seth, Garret, and we're going to be talking about how to live meaningfully and how to understand meaning in a world without free will, in a world that is determined and wholly causal in nature. Do you want to try and make some of the major points with this?
Like the main thing we want to talk about is like nihilism or the feeling of nihilism in the face of no free will, and how meaning can be reconciled to determinism. And I think there's a lot going in here to unpack, and it's going to probably be hard to go through all of it. But I really want to emphasize meaning, right? I think getting a really good understanding of meaning is like key. I think there's lots of cognitive errors that happen in the space that we have to work on. So, first of all, I think one paradigm for understanding the world is to understand it in terms of the fundamentals and the emergent, right? So there's this idea of reduction. Reductionism is when you take the emergent complexity, you break it into its building blocks to try to understand the building blocks. And then from those building blocks, you can reconstruct the emergent complexity. So when we're thinking about meaning, I think that meaning exists on this spectrum of complexity and fundamentality, right? So meaning, what is meaning? It's like the sense of importance, the sense of purpose. There's something to pursue, right? So that's like this complex idea. And then I think we have to break that into its fundamental ingredients to understand it in order to contextualize it in a deterministic framework. How do you feel about that so far?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Right. Okay. So like purposes are like these complex goals, right? So a purpose, what are you aiming at? It's like a long-term, deep, like extra important, maybe self-transcending goal. So purpose is this complex goal. And maybe there's lots of mini goals that lead to that purpose. And so like if we're breaking purpose into its parts, the purpose, it's a lot of important, deep, long-term self-transcending goals that add up to purpose. Okay, we've broken it down one layer. Purpose breaks down to goals. How do we break down goals? I think goals are, you've got I exist at point A and I need to go to point B. There's a trajectory, there's a vector, there's might be obstacles and rewards as punishment and reward as you move towards this goal. So like at this level, we're talking about values. Is this thing in my way? Is it valuable for my trajectory, or does it hinder my trajectory, right? So good and bad things start to occur. So values translates, right? We're breaking goals, breaks down to values. Values breaks down to goodness and badness. Like the things in our way, some of them are good, some are bad. What does goodness and badness break down to? I think that it fundamentally breaks down to pleasure and pain experientially. So how do you feel about that reductionary approach?
The pleasure and pain aspect of this makes it very epistemological in nature. This is, you have to speak about it in human language. And the most common ways that we understand spectrums are from good and bad and pleasure and pain. I'd say that's from a biological perspective, an evolutionary perspective. That probably speaks to that language.
Yeah. I think there's probably a good distinction to be made here that this reduction approach assumes a biological context. I think that's fair. Right. So like basically the idea is at the fundamental level, when biological creatures are pursuing their goals, they're getting dopamine, right? The dopamine is a sense of pleasure that tells them you're doing a good thing, which is you're going towards the food, right? So the going towards the food gives them a reward. Getting the food gives them a reward. Those are good things. So pleasure communicates the goodness of the process, right?
Right. So you could also say the goodness is in relation to others. So you want other people to be having the pleasure and other people to be affected positively by the the meaning that you're attributing to your experiences and the actions that you're taking.
Yeah. Okay. So that I think what you're going down like a social morality pathway, where so like you're going towards more complexity, whereas I'm going towards more simplistic, right? So we're going two different directions here. When we make things more simple, it's like in this very specific context, we go towards the food. This is in this little context, that's a good thing, right?
Right.
But if you
That's how,
expand the context, it gets more complicated.
right. Well, that's what we have to do we have to find ways that our philosophies apply to all of life for them to be accurate. Right.
Yeah, I think we can do that. That's why I've written multiple blogs and videos on metaethics, how you break down morality and you rebuild morality at the complex, right? Once you figure out the fundamentals, you can rebuild it complexly. But I think right now I think we're gonna try to focus on meaning instead of morality, right?
Right. So I guess I meant meaningful actions for the community and also for the self. So there's distinctions to be made there, and this idea of like prioritizing relation between self and other. So when you go to find meaningful actions, it's usually in the context of doing things that are positive for other people.
That is true. That is very true.
Right?
There is a very good relationship there, for sure.
But also
Yeah.
you have
So
to that's like eating food is good for you as the individual. Yeah.
right. So we're now we're talking at the level of purpose, right? Purpose is this complex goal. What is my purpose in life? Well, I am a human being. I live within a context of a society, which is within a context of a nation, in a context of a world, and I want to balance the goodness of all those things because I think existence is good, and I'm not a hypocrite. So if existence is good for me, existence is good for everyone else, and so I'm trying to balance all of those variables. And my purpose, I have a certain skill set, so I'm going to use my unique stance to aim towards this purpose. That's at a very complex layer. And I find meaning by doing all this complex purpose stuff, right?
Right. Yeah. That sounds about right.
Yeah. So I guess so now that we've got this paradigm for, how to break down meaning, now the question is meaning compatible with no free will?
Yeah, that's the tricky part.
Right.
If it's all determined, like if the reason that you're doing the thing is just to fulfill some mechanistic and easily predictable goal, then that kind of takes the fun out of it. For instance, perhaps this isn't exactly relevant to what I'm describing here, but when you find that a lot of people are predictable, like psychologists will say that 95% of the time people are running around on autopilot, I definitely see that. And so it's a little depressing to think that way because that means that people are easily manipulable. This is why people are easily advertised to, why advertisers treat people like animals, why they calculate the most appealing chemistry or neurochemistry to activate in people with the right imagery and the right manipulable categories. So it's throwing people into these predictive categories, saying that they're determined in this way. They're determined to act a particular way if I tweak the right knobs and if I treat them like a machine. And that's sad. That makes me sad to think that way, I guess. But, that's inherently taking the meaning out of our experiences until you learn this self-awareness process. And so this is kind of what I wanted to get on with this as well. This idea that once you learn mindfulness, once you learn self-esteem, self-awareness, and confidence in your ability to take on challenges and handle them with nuance, question yourself, practicing critical thinking, all of those qualities, that's so important. And the implication of that is that you are doing this that's making your life more meaningful, and you're doing that from a place of agency and free will, you could say. There's so many ways to look at free will and agency, but I think when you go to say that, well, I could say that I'm doing this well right now in my life, and I'm so self-aware and I'm so mindful now, and I'm able to correct my mistakes that I made in the past, and I'm a much better person. All of that is because I was so lucky to have watched some videos online. All this was because I just happened to go to the right school, learn from the right professors, and all that. So once again, it's back to meaninglessness and like
Oh,
determinism.
okay. So you
Or
jumped
purpose.
to like this, all this stuff in me is caused, therefore it's meaningless. How did you perform that
Oh,
deduction?
like I didn't
There's,
earn that. There's nothing that, like, there's no little so there's the homunculus argument, and Daniel Dennett gets to this too with the theater of consciousness, and a lot of people talk about this, but the idea is that there's a little man inside the back of your head that's calling the shots, and that's the homunculus that's controlling everything. And then just there's some part of you that is genuinely you that is making these choices, and then you value that about yourself. And that's when that's taken away, or when that's shown to be entirely mechanistic and causal, it leads to these postmodern nihilistic crises. It leads to cynicism and apathy, it seems. So we have to try and think of this in different ways, or completely try a different paradigm altogether, like Neoplatonism, or the substrate ontology as opposed to the substance ontology, and these kind of words.
okay, so in my paradigm of breaking down meaning, I broke it down to multiple layers. I think you mentioned values. So you're talking about meaning at the level of value, perhaps? You're saying you value this egotistical perspective of I earned it.
Yeah, it is egotistical. That's kind of the problem too, because you don't want to take too much pride in the fact that you did this thing. That's why I use the word self-esteem. Self-esteem helps with therapy. It helps people grow, I think. But pride kind of works counterintuitively or counterproductively.
So you have this value system, and the value system is basically like, if I earned it, that's good, and I feel pleasure. And then
Okay, so sorry to interrupt. I just to add to that, I think this also, it would take the meaning out of it if I did something good for other people, because that was also accidental. I also happened to learn these new values because I just so happened to be lucky enough to have the friends that taught me those things, the professor, or wherever I got those values from. They weren't created by me. And even if I did have an insight, this is another point, like the aha moment, where I can, like, this thing that identifies as Patrick takes credit for coining this new term, or creating this new philosophy. You can't create anything. Like, there's no creation. Everything is just emerging. Everything is doing what it's doing. Emergence is also a tricky term there, but you know what I mean? Like, because I built the bridge as my Boy Scout project to be an Eagle Scout. I built a fence, but I like to use the bridge as a metaphor. You'll have your insignia on that, like you'll say this is from Troop 534. You put your name on it, and you know that people are going to be benefited by walking across that bridge. They can cross the water and not have wet feet, and there's no credit to be taken there because you just happen to be lucky enough to be put into Boy Scouts by your parents. And then that resulted in a causal chain of effects that resulted in somebody suggesting the bridge. Or maybe you had the idea for a bridge, but you probably got that idea from somewhere else. Like that problem of you probably got this from someone else, that in its essence is very problematic here, I believe. Because there's no originality. There's nothing new under the sun, is the phrase.
yeah.
We don't like the West, but I think the East, they do better with that because they're prioritizing the relation first, I guess. Or they're prioritizing the connectedness, and that they're more comfortable with the not so much causality. It's more they're just comfortable with being an integrated part of the system to a very deep level. It's deeply embedded in them, kind of like the Borg, but not exactly like the Borg. I've been thinking about that a lot too. In Star Trek, you have where they have literally a linked mind where they're all hearing each other's thoughts all the time. That's not what's happening, but they're more comfortable with being influenced by other people and not taking a whole egotistical credit for everything that comes to them. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. So I think there's two approaches to take to this that could probably be synergized. So one approach is to just like not be egotistical, right? So it'd be to just change your value system. Now, obviously, like changing your value system, not that easy maybe, but I think we can change our value systems. We just have to process a new way of looking at things. It's
Right.
like if you kind of subtract the ego, it's like, well, I earned this thing, therefore I feel good. It's like, okay, let's get rid of that value system. I say, well, what is meaningful? If that is not meaningful, what is meaningful, right? And so that goes back to how do we get meaning in the first place, right? Meaning comes from pleasure and pain. That bubbles up into good and bad, bubbles up into values. Okay, so like other people have pleasure and pain. Other people, like good things can be done for other people, bad things can be done for other people. The bridge, it does all of this good for other people because they no longer have the discomfort, you know? And so instead of looking inside yourself for I earned it, therefore I have pleasure, you can look externally and say, all of these people have increased well-being and I have compersion or I have confelicity. My well-being is connected to their well-being, and therefore I observe all of these happy people. Now I'm happy. Now I have meaning, right?
Right. Yeah, I'm so glad you reminded me of that word too. The original word for compersion is confelicity, is felicity as in happiness, like confelicity, you're all being happy together because of other people's happiness.
Yes.
Yeah, that's really good. So let me try and destroy that argument too. Okay, so just make this as horrible as possible. So
let's stare into the abyss and see what
yeah,
comes
okay,
out.
well that's what I was gonna say. Is Nietzsche and perhaps the hardcore nihilists would say that this is all a game that we're playing together. And so the game language gets really problematic too, because games aren't real. There's lots of different definitions of what a game is, but we often describe that as not reality, as not real. This is the fantasy that we're engaging in. And so if all of reality is a fantasy, then whoops, we're all just doing this thing mechanistically together by accident, and then actually none of these impacts mean anything. But okay, so that I counter by arguing that, well, I like the feeling that I get from having positive effects on other people, or this system of 35 trillion cells that identifies as Patrick, that is a system in this connected cognitive distributed cognition system of the human superorganism, realizes that its collective superorganism reality is benefiting from this. You can't just, you have to stop at some point. You can't just completely nullify everything as just atoms bouncing around and just it's like the people have a hard time accepting the fact that nobody ever touches anything because atoms never truly touch. You have a sensation of feeling, but you can also think your way out of that to where feeling itself is not even valuable, like a pleasant feeling or like making love and that kind of thing. You know, that's just atoms bouncing together, but they're not actually touching, so you never fully connect. And so that's an argument for one of the four existential givens that Irvin Yalom gives, where it's the problem of isolation. And we all feel extreme isolation in many ways, probably more so in the West. Again, that's probably deep-seated in our history and our unconscious philosophy there, but you know what I'm saying?
I think you're like tiptoeing around an argument that I think is important to address. So let me see if I'm framing the argument you're tiptoeing around. It sounds like you're saying determinism is basically materialism, and materialism is meaningless because it's just atoms. That seems like what's going on here. How is that true?
I think that's the argument. Again, this isn't me feeling this. I have my own arguments against this too, but this seems to be the Western conception. The staring into the abyss is staring into an abyss of nothingness. And so Nietzsche's like, be careful, don't stare into the abyss because it'll stare right back into you. And then this emptiness of void will just, you'll gaze into that and it'll gaze into you. And then in the East, you have this notion of the substrate ontology, or this idea that it's the Bhavanga is the ground of all being, and the ground of all being is likened to soil, where soil has this infinite potential to produce things, like real things, real objects. And that's you can return to that too. Like the Judeo-Christian and Western religions are kind of paranoid of that way of thinking, because returning to nothingness, or maybe that's how those beliefs came about, is because a paranoia against returning to absolute nothingness is unacceptable. That's terrifying. It's another one of the existential givens. And so we create this heavenly paradise that's external to the world. This is the two worlds mythology, whereas in the East, it's all one world. You keep reincarnating. You keep coming back to this because it's a substrate, a ground of all being that produces infinite creation and infinite potential, if that makes sense.
I think so. So, but back to the determinism is basically materialism, and materialism is basically just atoms, and atoms are meaningless. Therefore, determinism is meaningless. Is that kind of one of your arguments?
Yeah, I think that's how that's usually taken. And I want to draw some kind of parallel to this with the relation relata aspect of this. So there's more of an unconscious desire to connect the atoms in the East, whereas in the West, it's more the relata, the distinct entities of the atoms. This is kind of atomism, the way Democritus described it, where everything is separate and distinct. And this is how we do psychology. We break people down into these parts, diagnosis, to divide in order to know the diagnosis. And that it's like at every single level you are this mechanistic entity that is meaningless in all of these layers. Is no meaning to that, because the relation, the prioritization of the relation is not what's held primary. It's more these distinct categories. There's a lot of philosophy behind this too, and there's also left and right brain hemisphere arguments from Yema Gilchrist on this, but I think that's a factor involved here, at least.
Why would you jump to the conclusion that all of these subcomponents are meaningless?
I think because it is inherently mechanistic in nature. Like, it's all an accident that these atoms are bouncing against each other, and the molecules
is it an accident though?
Well, then we have to ask, what is creation, and we have to ask if there is a creator, or if I don't know how to think about the relation argument. I'm a Westerner, and I'm trying to not be. It's deeply ingrained into me to think deterministically, to think materialistically and physically, as a physicalist, I guess you could say, to use all these ists and isms. I think if it was more, because I'm trying not to say romanticism is what I'm getting at, and I think that's not what the Eastern philosophies do. Throughout time, they've been giving distinct descriptions of concepts and distinct descriptions of ontological reality and epistemological understanding. Contemplative sciences were founded in the East, and that it doesn't come off as romanticism to give romantic descriptions of why the atoms are together, whereas in the West, it's anything that even smells slightly like romanticism is instantly rejected, because we have to think of this as a step-by-step causal process, I think.
Yeah. Oh man, so we're going to creation. Okay, so.
Well, that was kind of one factor, but yeah.
I mean, so okay. There's a distinction between teleology and teleonomy. Most people have never heard of teleonomy. Teleology was kind of alluded to by Aristotle. Aristotle was basically saying, like, all these creatures, they have a purpose, and teleology is basically the purpose of a creature. It's like, this tree or this seed is supposed to become an oak tree, and this infant is supposed to become a human, and basically you are born with all these purposes. A lot of people kind of, like you said, like Western mentality, kind of like this purpose idea, it seems too magical. It's like, God has given me a purpose. It's like bestowed upon your head. You're supposed to go do this in the world. Okay, so in my opinion, the problem is top-down thinking versus bottom-up thinking, right? When God bestows a purpose on your head, that's top-down, right? Someone above you is giving it to you. So lots of people reject this top-down purpose stuff. Okay, that's teleology. We can reject that if we want. But I think teleonomy, that's real. Teleonomy is emergent purpose, emergent, grassroots, from the ground up, from the bottom up. And so basically the principles of evolution are based on principles of existence. That which can exist will exist. If you're a bacteria, if you can figure out how to eat, then you can survive and reproduce. And so at every layer of evolution are existence-based goals, right? That's the entire process is guided by existence-based principles, and the only way to satisfy existence-based principles is to develop existence-based goals. I got to go eat the food. I got to go, got to go mate. I got to go, take care of my children. These are all my goals because that's how the system works. So there's all these goals and purposes built in from the bottom up.
Right. So the primary purposes you gave there were the I have to mate and I have to raise my children and I have to eat. And I think that's all that boils down to for the materialist and the determinist. Whereas the rest of the meaning that we attribute to this, it's all made up. Like, I want to be a musician, I want to be a philosopher, I want to work in psychology, I want to have impact on other people. That's emergent and that's not designed by it. So there's like the idea of exaptation, which is taking what evolution gave us and creating something out of that. And so any of that, once that creation process comes, or the human idea of creating out of that and doing something more than what evolution dictated, that's where that's meaningless, because you're just making it up. And so we conform to this mechanistic narrative. But there are tons of ways to go against this too. And I should pull up my ChatGPT conversation with this. I asked ChatGPT, and also tried to think about this beforehand. I try not to rely too highly on this, but just give me a list of all the things that determinism and materialism and physicalism cannot describe currently. And he gave me a pretty detailed list. One is obviously consciousness. Another one's love. Love is a huge concept, but you could also say that's meaningless. So I have a friend who's a biologist, and his wife is also into biology, and he says that they have a pretty good conception of that. They're okay with saying that their relationship is wholly based on neurochemistry and chemical impulses. But I think with most people, you want to have more, like, it inherently needs poetry. It inherently needs creativity and considering gift giving and creation of unique ideas and like surprises and that kind of thing. So there's no surprises in this way either. There's no such thing as a surprise or anything new, because evolution is the name of the game, or causality is the name of the game, I should say.
Yeah.
But I also think that's like, it's very rudimentary to think that way. I think the species at large is moving past that.
Right. So you mentioned that, like, according to this reductive deterministic evolutionary paradigm, all we care about is basically survival and reproduction. I think that is a fallacy, because existence is not merely based on survival and, well, I mean, it's not based on simplistic survival and simplistic reproduction. So, like, it's not about dodging tigers. Like, existence, there's, okay, think about it this way. Like, we're a tribal species, right? Like Aristotle, he said, like, man needs society. Like, some people, they think they don't need society. These people are crazy. They're either gods or they're beasts, because men, we can't do everything. Like, someone learns how to build shoes, someone learns how to build swords. Like, everyone specializes and we work together, we cooperate. We need each other to exist, to survive. So survival it's a complicated concept that incorporates all of the romantic things of life, right? Like group cohesion, like humor and music and dancing. This all creates group cohesion, which makes us survive. You know what I mean?
That's why I don't like exaptation or the concept of emergence, because it insinuates that that's something. It insinuates accidental, and I think there's just so much more that evolution gave us, and the process of natural selection selected for. Like, it's selected for us to be social beings. That's certainly the case. Look at chimpanzees and most mammals. They're working along those lines of cooperation and sharing of resources, but also this hierarchy, and there's a lot of social competition that's going on in the rest of the animal kingdom.
Right. And so, I mean, like you said, like love is like a perfect example of something that is evolutionarily good for helping us accomplish those complex goals of existence. Like when we pair bond, we work together. And if we have offspring that needs, like if we have a complex society, then our offspring needs to be raised to be taught in order to be able to inherit a complex society. They need like a home that, yeah, stability, people to teach them. like like if you just like leave your child in the wilderness because you're like if you're an animal that doesn't really care about your offspring because you don't love them, then like they're not going to be ready to exist. They're not going to exist. They're going to die because they need a complex society to thrive in. You know what I mean?
Right. All right. So I want to take a look at this list actually, and
Okay.
I'll share it here. And then I'd like to talk more about what you wrote, if we can. So here's ChatGPT's answer. This is from our Polymath Park podcast last night. We were asking what cannot be explained in terms of determinism, reductionism, entropy, and possibly science itself. Give a detailed list from many philosophical perspectives. This should be a list of meaningful, tangible aspects of the human condition. This is a fascinating question that touches on the boundaries of human understanding. It's so complimentary. So, subjective experience, phenomenology. Husserl and Merleau-Ponty got into this heavily, and I very much think about phenomenology a lot myself lately. The idea is when you're asking what is real in the world, you can say, well, if anything's happening, there's certainly experiences happening. There's some entities here, these 35 trillion cells here are experiencing something. We're having phenomena of some kind, so that's certainly real. And I also like to couple that with Gibson's affordances, their natural properties, natural laws of the universe that allow for entities to come into these forms and have these desires. Like fractals is an example of that. The fractal nature of trees, and bilateral symmetry is another one where you have two eyes, two nostrils, and two ears, and two
How is
hands.
that related to phenomenology?
So the existence of things, I'm kind of just saying that those are also factors that are inherent properties of reality, of epistemological and ontological reality, is that you work with these scaffolds, these frameworks. Like nature has its own frameworks for design, and natural selection is working on those to create these creatures with bilateral symmetry and fractal designs.
Yeah. Okay.
And that makes that there are ways to perceive that as meaningful and ways to perceive that as something to interact with, as opposed to viewing that negatively, I believe. But that's kind of a long story. So also free will, metaphysics, and ethics. Talked about ethics before to a great extent. Meaning and purpose, that's what we're talking about right now. Existential philosophy. Love and emotional depth. Okay, so it uses this word romanticism here as if love necessitates romanticism. And when I think of romanticism, I think of rose-colored glasses. I think that's a lot of people here, at least I'm trying not to take any perspectives, which is really hard. But when I hear the way that people use the word romanticism, it's usually dismissive, and it's like you're doing some kind of lying to yourself, or you're doing some kind of
Kind of like a poetic view of reality, perhaps.
Yeah, it's absolutely it's poetic in nature, which I think is absolutely important as well. That's kind of another affordance that the natural laws allow for us to have, is these abilities to create to create prose and create poetry. Yeah, and artistic creativity and aesthetics, cognitive science. Like, why do we have a preference for certain styles of aesthetics? Why does this cardigan have this print? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because over time, the human collective thought that was a really good design. Like, you couldn't have this going in lots of different directions in a unorderly fashion. And you also can't just write music that's not structured in some way that's appealing to the majority. If it's too abstract, if it's too out there, then people will notice that, and it'll be chaotic.
Right.
And that's a human preference, but that's also kind of an affordance. That's something that's based in nature, I believe.
I think I don't know if I should jump in here, but
No, go ahead.
if you look at the animal kingdom, lots of animals have mating dances, right? Where like there's an artistic expression of dancing, and then the mate is judging them based on their aesthetic, right? I think it's probably a mixture of it's kind of a representation of like your first of all your physical like fitness enable your fluidity of movement. There's a certain physical fitness aspect to it, and there's also a mental fitness aspect to it. Like, is your mind ordered or is your mind chaotic? Do you have the right balance of order and chaos? A little bit of creativity, but not too much. You know what I mean?
Right. If you have too much chaos, that becomes diagnosable as schizophrenia or other. Like a lot of people have described schizophrenia as that where it's not grounded in reality. It's not grounded in this social substrate, this cognitive glue that we seem to have between cognitive entities.
Right.
So, but that can also be trained, though. That's kind of a point I want to make too. That you can learn that, and you can kind of top down relearn that, or that's a very uncomfortable thing too. And there's a lot of discussion about that going around right now. Is like using scripts and like a list of the ways to mechanistically act and behave in reality, and that can be uncomfortable. But that's kind of another topic. So yeah, ethics and moral truths and meta ethics.
Yeah.
Moral truths are non-natural and cannot be reduced to scientific and empirical facts. Hume points out the is-ought gap. Yeah, we talked about that in detail. Concepts of identity. Again, I think that's very influenced by Western versus Eastern perspectives. And the postmodernist says, my current conception of my identity is what's to be held primary. And that's what's most meaningful to me is my experiences and my current quote unquote lived experience. That's the word that's been going around a lot lately. Altruism and so. Okay, so I have a lot of opinions on this one. So there are countless examples of other species using altruism, other species acting kindly, going against the grain, as it were. Quite literally, cells will choose to do that. Skin cells, when left to their own devices, will not just follow one gradient towards food and another gradient against or away from fear and away from a possible threat. They'll also make what seems like choices, and that could be random. You could argue what random means and all that, but there's definitely videos of dogs trying to save fish from drown or from not being in the water, whatever you call that for fish, where they're like trying to shovel water onto them with their snout while the fish is on land. And there's a video of a monkey saving a kitten from a well, like a muddy well that's full. Kitten can't get out. And dolphins and orcas and whales will also save humans from drowning and from sharks from possible threats at their own expense. Like that's kind of the key point there. They could be putting themselves at risk in doing these activities.
Yeah.
And you could say that determinism results in that, or that evolution and natural selection selected for kindness. Like a lot of people describe determinism and materialism as the quote is, nature is red in tooth and claw. And there's this whole exposition on that. I forget who wrote that, but it's very brutal. It describes nature as very brutal in nature, and its origin and the way that it creates things is through so much sacrifice and so much violence. And that is true, but it seems like it's doing better now. This is kind of something I was working on a while back, just with the idea of the deliberate selection. Like natural selection starting to create deliberate selection organisms. They're working on a more deliberate selection where they can quite literally intervene upon the genetic qualities of themselves and other organisms, like we do genetic modification of crops and all that. But also it's allowing for what seems like choice, like freely willed choice. There's a will and there's a deliberation between what I should do and what my limbic system tells me I should do, or what my ancient genes are telling me I should do.
Right.
And sacrifice, quite literally. Yeah, the emergence of novelty. So the novelty is a hard question, or that's a hard concept. Like we were saying, there's nothing new under the sun. So what is novelty, right?
Yeah.
So when you create something novel, you want to take credit for it. At least in the West, at least for me, this has been my experience in the past. I don't feel like this is much anymore. I've entered more of a participatory conception of myself and those around me. I mean, using the word myself as well, I'm consistently questioning that, because there's no one individual self. You are kind of a product of your past experiences, and that is until you're more able to intervene upon that.
Yep.
Yeah, I could say a lot more about that, but I'm going to try to hold off on that. So when you have ideas, it does feel good to express those ideas when other people tell you that they're valuable ideas, but also you can get caught up in, oh snap, I'm really onto something. Like when you're writing something, you have the aha moment, or you're working out an idea as you're working on a book or a particular philosophy, or a song, when you're writing a song and you have a really cool beat, a really cool rhythm that you make. I have these feelings often, and I want to change. Like, you want to pursue those because they make you feel good, and the operating process that's going on there is that it's the ego is feeling good from the idea formation, and so it's kind of this self-fueling loop that's highly egotistical in nature. And so you have to kind of match that with or conquer that with the impact that you're going to have with the music later on, or the impact that you're going to have with the philosophy that you're creating. And that seems very tricky. Like, it seems like that's also harder for the Westerner. I don't know, though. Again, I haven't grown up in the East, but I want to get your opinion on that too, man. How you think about, like, is that something that has to be trained? Do you have this egotistic instinct first, where it's, I'm getting so excited about my new coinage, I coined this cool new term? Because this happens a lot in our group chat discussions, where people are throwing around a lot of cool fancy terms, and I wonder if that is what's going on there. Like, does that have to be suppressed or overcome by reminding yourself that, oh wait, you're doing this for the good of other people? I ask that while also trying to emphasize this point that you do get that natural feedback from other people. You just have to wait for that, I guess, is the problem there. You have to wait for people saying, wow, those words really helped me, man, or the way you made me think about that, that's really helping me and improving my life in a way. That's fueling as well. Like, that's very, to me, much better. I mean, in the vast majority of cases, it seems that the positive impacts I have are much better than the songs that I create, and the fun that I'm having in doing more self-indulgent creation, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I think, I mean, my understanding is that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is what hosts the selfish, selfless parts of the brain. I guess the more egotistical and the more other focused parts. And they kind of, my understanding is they do like opponent processing, right? It's like, okay, we got to prioritize the self. It's all about me. And then the other is like, no, it's all about other people. And they kind of like find this balance, and we do actions based on this. They wrestle and then come to a conclusion, and we do. And some people have a stronger, egotistical side, and so they do the more selfish thing. Some people have a stronger selfless side. They do the, they do the more selfless thing. But there's a constant battle. The context will shift the variables in one's favor. In a certain context, one wins. Different context, another wins. And you can probably develop like a muscle, right? Neurons that fire together, wire together. If you constantly have rituals that put yourself into a context that allow one side of the brain to activate more strongly, you can probably build it up like a muscle if that's the goal.
Right. Yeah. And you want to have the desire to do that too, and developing that desire to change yourself from a place of a natural desire for that, instead of considering it like Stockholm syndrome, or like tricking yourself into doing that. I think that's a lot of what we see in Western psychology and postmodernism. It's almost like the encouragement to, I'm not trying to get on a tangent here, I think this is quite relevant, but with the psychology and the diagnostic default that we've talked about, the tendency to use these diagnostic terms as rigid fixed identities, when you go to encourage someone to work on themselves and to make these changes to work parts of the brain like a muscle, that's an infringement on their rights to identify as the current version of themselves. So it's kind of like a human rights issue that I think we're stumbling into. Yeah, this is a long topic too. We've been talking about this as well in the Polymath Park group to a great extent. But yeah, I do want to I want to say that's rooted in the Western egocentrism, right? Like that's the resistance to wanting to change the self. You're changing yourself for yourself so you can live healthier and feel better, but also so that you can behave better in society and then you can benefit other people by your behaviors improving.
Yeah, it's tricky because not everything is completely flexible. And so like the religious side of the Western debate has been like, you can always repent and change and evolve towards something better. And then like the religious people are just persecuting homosexuals, like, come on, just change to be straight. Like just rewire everything. What's wrong with you? And so we've got this dialectic where it's like half the society is like, hey, screw you guys. He can't change that. So stop telling him to change. Well, it's like some things are more flexible, some things are less flexible. We have to kind of find the balance between both, right?
But that requires context. That requires zooming out and high detail abstract thinking, which is also not what we see in the West. This is again based on a lot of McGilchrist research, but the left brain it's mechanistic in nature. It's mechanistic and reductionist. It processes through a reductionist lens. It's linear and sequential in its processing. It fixates on explicit measurable data, and it's not context centered. The right brain is more context centered, and so and not to draw immediate parallels between Western and Eastern cultures, but there have been studies done where they show when you do images like I think we might have talked about this before with the 3 fish, and the fish are in the ocean with some coral reefs behind them and a few other objects, and the Westerners will always they'll ask you to look at this image for about 5 seconds, and then after that they ask them, all right, what did you see here? Westerners see the fish, they might notice a slight difference in one of the fins on the fish, but they notice 3 fish. Easterners see the fish along with the coral reef, along with all the other objects in the picture. So that's also being used as marketing strategies. Like this is so deeply seated that advertisers are recognizing it and using it to their advantage. Wow. Samsung specifically advertises phones like this, where they'll say, this new cell phone will make you feel more included in the, you'll be a better addition to the collective. You'll be able to be literally more connected with other people, and you'll be able to increase the betterment of everyone there. And then in the West, this is going to make you look better to other people. You're going to be able to show off better. Look at these cool face altering apps and all that make you look prettier.
Yeah.
So I do like when you want to know if this is something that's deeply embedded, I think looking at what advertisers are doing is probably a good, you know what I mean? That's probably a good measure, because they've caught on to it, and that means that there's something real.
Yeah, advertisers and insurance, they know the secret truths no one wants to talk about.
Yeah.
I think I want to talk about consciousness, because I think consciousness is probably the most important one to discuss to resolve this this meaning question. So remember how I remember how I reduced purpose down to pleasure and pain?
Right.
So I did this reductive thing, taking meaning and breaking down to its fundamental ingredients. Then you kind of did this thing where you're like, determinism is basically materialism, which is basically atoms moving around like billiard balls, which is basically meaningless, right? So there's 2 reductive paradigms that we've built here. One is meaningless. The other, do you think pain and pleasure are meaningless?
Meaning, well, of course they're meaningful. I think when I think of meaning, I've thought this way for a long time, especially after listening to John Verbekey's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Meaning can be attributed to anything you want, and so my default response is, let's make reality as meaningful as possible. Let's attribute meaning to as much as possible, because to do otherwise, it's probably going to give you existential crises and result in staring into the abyss.
Right. So I agree with that approach, but also we want to debate like the strongest version of nihilism possible.
Right.
So do you think it's possible to say pain and pleasure are meaningless?
Well, yeah, so then I would just flip it and say everything is as meaningless as you want it to be.
So in my opinion, you can't say that logically. So I want to see if we can get agreement on that.
Well, I want to say, so the reason I say that is because if we're describing humans as the meaning-making creatures, like it's our duty, or it's our epistemic and evolutionary duty to make things meaningful, then we can say that we're also making pain meaningful and making pleasure meaningful or meaningless. So the utility in this, or the teleology in this, would be when you're experiencing pain, you can take the Buddhist approach or the mindfulness approach and try to manage that in ways like create the meaning around that, like question the meaning that you attribute. If the meaning is just kind of surface level, or if it's the instant reaction that like a child would have to getting a skinned knee, or just a basic injury, it's just instant pain. This is horrible. This is incredibly bad. It can't possibly teach me anything. It can't make me more resilient. I will cry because I am a mechanistic meat machine that has no control over my emotions, or no control over my experiences, and no control over my reaction to my experiences. And then you develop mindfulness, you become an adult, you learn that reality is full of pain. You have literally 200 different types of pain receptors. This is insane. Like, and so I did a video on this a while back. Like, it's your 200 types of pain receptors versus what I call SNOOD, which is your serotonin, noradrenaline, oxytocin, natural opiates or endoopioids, and dopamine. And that's kind of the neurochemicals that you're using to fight against those 200 types of pain receptors. So that's not very fair. Like, evolution is just like, all right, here's all these ways to protect the organism from bumping into disease, from injuring
Have you
itself.
seen the diagram of substance P? Like neurotransmitters are like little, they're little chemicals, they're little molecules, right? Like dopamine, oxytocin, they're these little atomic structures. Substance P is one of the neurotransmitters associated with pain, and it's like this big mammoth. It's like a titanic molecule. It's like, so like you talking about like in terms of quantity, there's also like size, magnitude. Like the pain neurotransmitter like walks around like this big bully in your biology.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
That's wild. Yeah.
Okay,
so yeah, I mean, you'd question the meaning of the experience that you're having. That's your greatest tool, is to try and make it as try and be having as much agency and control over the meaning that you attribute to your experiences as possible.
Okay. So like I agree that you can build meaning at multiple levels of analysis, right? You got the meaning at the purpose layer, the goal layer, the values, the goodness, badness, the pain and pleasure. Pain and pleasure, that's the consciousness layer, right? So like all of this is consciousness, just simple consciousness versus complex consciousness. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that pain and pleasure, it's fundamentally meaningful at the fundamental layer. Like pain is just axiomatically, by default, pain has negative meaning, right? And pleasure has positive meaning just fundamentally. And then you like at a more complex layer, you can like build a narrative, wrap a narrative around it, try to reframe it, and you can try to take this negative meaning and say, well, I'm dieting and I'm hungry. I've got all this pain because I'm dieting. So I've got all this fundamental pain. But think about the future. Like I've got this goal I'm working towards. I'm going to have this ideal body. And like, let's frame that into a narrative of pleasure, right? This ideal body is such a pleasurable idea. So now we're counterbalancing this fundamental pain with emergent pleasure, right?
Right. I want to say that, I mean, I don't want to get off this point accidentally, but I want to say that contentment and resilience and composure are also fundamental aspects of reality, or just neutrality. So I was kind of going along with this as a philosophy for a while, just trying to be neutral, which is kind of stoicism. And I wanted to say that's the base state of reality, because nothing is, like, there is no thing, and everything is kind of scale.
What's the
Um,
base state?
the base state of nature is nothing and emptiness, and this is aligned with nihilism and all that. But
Does that
because before there was anything, there was nothing, I guess, or because there was no, before there was experiences, there was just neutrality. And so entropy also is a fundamental aspect of reality in physics, at least. Um, everything's trying to get to a more balanced and neutral state via entropy. And so that's kind of what I want to do when it comes to pain and also pleasure. So there's, you see in the Eastern traditions, there's the restriction of hedonism and the viewing of sex as a reproductive act. If you're going to do it, you need to do it extremely mindfully through a karmic practice, the Karma Sutra. And the yeah, that's hard to think about, but
are you
I
aware that there's like there's philosophic thought about how nothingness is impossible?
right, yeah, I'm still wrapping my head around that too. I feel my brain is just, it's hard for it to understand. But yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense to me though, because okay, so I was thinking about this morning actually. The With this relation relata dichotomy, so the I'll try to describe this right. So the universe came into being because it had to. A lot of people give that argument. Sounds like circular reasoning. But if you take as the fundamental foundational field, or the foundational quality of everything before there was something, as relation, it's this need to have things related that brought about the distinct entities of the relata, that brought about the atoms in the first place, because what is the ground of all being is actually relation at its core. So before the Big Bang happened, I guess, you had this underlying desire, this desire for relating something, and it needed to relate something, so it created the distinct entities, whatever it is and whatever creation is. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think I got that.
I think the words make sense, but to me they don't match reality very well. But I want to focus on more about the relationship between consciousness and meaning.
Sure.
So I want to try to go back to that. So you were saying that like determinism is like materialism, which is like blah blah blah, atoms and meaninglessness. So I want to say that determinism is 100% compatible with consciousness, right? So your list here, the first thing on the list is consciousness is not compatible with determinism. I want to disagree with that, right? Subjective experience,
Yeah.
phenomenology. So basically, so determinism is the idea that everything has a cause. Pretty simple. So imagine a universe that has no materials, right? No atoms, no billiard balls. Imagine a universe where everything is qualia, okay? So qualia, think conscious experience is like emergent, complex objects of consciousness, right? We have to break down conscious experience. So like if I see a dinosaur on a TV screen, that's a complex conscious experience. We need to break that down into its parts. So it's like there's like 10,000 pixels. There's like some green pixels over here, red pixels over here. So we're breaking it down into all these conscious particles. Those are the qualia, the fundamental ingredients that build this complex tapestry. Okay, so imagine a world it's just all these qualia particles bumping around, right? And so you could have like laws of qualia, just like for atoms we have laws of physics. It's like this atom and this atom, they interact in this predictable fashion. Well, what if there are laws of qualia that says there's one unit of pain, there's one unit of pleasure, they come together and they do something, there's a unit of red, there's a unit of green, they repel against each other. Like you could have causation amongst conscious entities, if that makes sense. Let me rehash that a little bit because so like I was just saying that these qualia entities could like bounce or combine or whatever. That's a very materialistic way to look at interaction, right? Two balls bounce off each other. I mean, they don't like the causation doesn't have to be movement based. It could be like pleasure and pain come together and it creates chocolate. And, you know, red and green come together and they create yellow. So it's like you could have causal relationships with qualia that are unique but still deterministic. The color yellow is compatible with determinism because red and green cause yellow to exist. Yellow is forced into existence.
Oh, right. Okay, so that's
Yellow
right.
doesn't have free will. It's like red and green, boom. Oh, now I exist. I'm yellow.
Right. So it's kind of the like this would be the relata giving way to the relation. The two relatable entities are the distinct qualities of the red and the blue equaling the purple or the green. Yeah.
Photons are different from crayons, but whatever.
Yeah. And there's also arguments that the brain works like this as well with like the yuck versus yum response of the limbic system. A lot of our experiences can be boiled down to that. So there's an avoidance of pain and then going up the gradient towards pleasure or towards sustenance through food or whatever. And then there's also like the disgust response of the insular cortex and then the pleasure response of yummy food. Yeah. I mean, I want to say that this probably does boil down to that distinction between two distinct entities versus the one or the oneness that's seen in a lot of the Eastern traditions. And then from that oneness comes forth the two distinct entities. But I don't know. I don't know if this is, it's hard for me to describe this. I'm not as educated on this as I should be.
You're talking about the Taoism. One gave birth, or zero gave birth to one gave birth to two gave birth to three. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, like Neoplatonism gets into the idea of having multiple forms. So a chair is not just one chair. It can be viewed as a sitting thing, or it can be viewed as an object for interaction. It has a sitting quality.
One thing I think you would agree is important is like, I mean, just because the Easterners say something doesn't mean it's true. It's like we've got to have like an epistemic reason to believe it, right?
So I want to say that the relation is what's most important here to me, like the ability to connect things that came first. That's kind of what is how we navigate a problem space, how we create ideas is by combining things.
It seems like you want to associate relation with consciousness. Is that, am I correct in intuiting that?
Yeah. My definition of consciousness right now is sitting at basically awareness. And then you have meta-consciousness or metacognition and meta-awareness that allows you to recursively look back on that. So to use Vervaeke's language, relation is relevance realization. To apply that to consciousness, you would call that relevance realization. To apply that to, or at least decision-focused consciousness and problem solving and cognition, you're relating concepts together. You're relating to or multiple elements. It's not just like two distinct entities either. That's that can be very misleading very quickly. But you want to blend multiple philosophies together. You want to bring them together into one. That's realizing the relevant qualities of each, and then trying to find a through line between them.
Okay, so going back to this meaning paradigm, meaning as consciousness, how do you feel about saying that consciousness is fundamentally meaningful?
Fundamentally is also a tricky word. We have to define these terms. Well, yeah, I mean, the part of me that wants to attribute meaning to everything possible and realizing that I have a duty and responsibility to do that as a requirement of my evolutionary quality of having a brain, I would say, of course, consciousness is meaningful.
Yeah.
Awareness is
Like,
it's like fundamental to everything else you're doing. You have to be aware of a thing to make a decision about a thing, to have metacognition, to do this self-improvement. And so self-improvement and societal improvement, or community actualization and self-actualization in Maslow's terms, that comes from the fundamental quality of being a conscious, aware agent. And then you want to increase that agency and awareness as much as possible.
so like one thing that is like kind of key here is to understand that like conscious experience is always meaningful for the creature at a minimum, right? So it's like we could all be psychopaths and be like, well, who cares about this deer that's bloody, wounded, in pain in the forest? Like, not my problem. Like maybe it's not meaningful for us, but at a minimum, it's meaningful for the deer because the deer is experiencing all of that, right?
Right.
So that's kind of how I think of it. It's like everywhere we look, there's meaning. Like every single conscious creature is like an entity that's full of meaning because their consciousness is meaning. That's the essence of meaning, right? And so when you view the world as all of these conscious creatures, all of them, they've got basic pain and pleasure. They've got value systems like I'm itchy, I'm hungry. They've got goals like I need to go hunt, I need to go become a musician. They've got purposes like I need to do this for my community. Like all of these creatures, they all exist within multiple layers of meaning. All of that is meaningful to them. And if you're connected to them, then it should be meaningful to you as well.
Right, and you have genetic predispositions towards that as well that are deterministically caused. I want to say that really the perspective on determinism that makes it into a meaningless thing, I think people are just trying to view things negatively. Like they're not trying to. Perhaps that's a natural quality of existence as well, as defaulting to it could be a path of least resistance that's at play here, where we can say if it's all causal, I don't have to do any work, or it's all causal and I don't have to try to make meaning out of it. Perhaps that takes more effort to think bigger in that way. We're just surrounded by so much negativity and so much bloodshed and the horrible atrocities of what nature required to bring us here. This fact that there's like 99% of species are gone now because of this process of naturally selecting the next best organism, survival of the fittest. These are what I think the determinist or the negative nihilistic determinist would say the most primary aspect of causality, and the causality that underlies natural selection is this red in tooth and claw quality of natural selection, survival of the fittest, and sex being for reproduction, not for knowing your partner better. Because making love is not a concept there, so it is just sex, or the interactions. Those are all just like that's emergent and it's accidental, I guess. The kindness and the goodness and the gentleness. We have to remind ourselves, like, why do we have to keep reminding ourselves of that? Why is it written into every holy book, this golden rule that you want to treat your neighbor as yourself, treat your enemy as you'd want to be treated? You know,
Right.
this is why I don't use the term enemy, because I don't like think that way. I think it's a useless word, because everyone to me is just another person that I can have the best relationship with as possible.
Yeah. Fundamentally, like whether we understand it or not, we are connected to everyone, and so that means that we should care about everyone and everything. Like it just like even pragmatically based on your own self-interest, right? It's like why would you go hunt and destroy all the whales? Like we have to work together in balance. Like you can't just abuse
man.
anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. We're all connected, whether we understand it or not.
I think that to think of it through Michael Levin's lens and just cell morphology, the cells have an underlying desire to come together and to create this one organism And there's so much at play in preserving that organism. There's so much genetic dispositions towards choosing yourself as opposed to sacrificing yourself for another. And you have to have a narrative to do something else or to do otherwise, like the narrative of war, where your nationalism, where your nation is the best nation and all the other nations deserve to die. The people of that nation, literally, you will put your life on the line. You will sacrifice this organism to keep that narrative consistent. But also in that is the prioritization of your own society. So there is kind of a good quality of that. Like you're trying to look out for your family and your extended nation family. But
you brought it. There's a really interesting thing. I forget there's a biologist or a neuroscientist. I forget which. There's this guy, Nick Bostrom. I forget who it is. Basically, he was studying bacteria, and he said that there are bacteria that will do what seems like altruistic acts of self-sacrifice. Viruses can infect bacteria. Bacteria exist within a colony, like a little society of bacteria. If the virus gets inside one of the bacteria, the virus can cause the bacteria to start producing more virus and infect the colony. So the bacteria will self-destruct before it harms the tribe. You know what I mean?
Right. This is what cells do before they become cancerous.
Yeah.
The cells are programmed to take each other out, or so the cell will take itself out, and then the other cells also have programming to take out that one cancerous cell before it becomes cancerous if it doesn't do it itself. And then if those two factors don't happen, then you start to see cancer emerging. Yeah.
So it's like this altruism. It's like it's ingrained evolutionarily all the way down to bacteria. So like this is saying that you can't explain altruism with determinism, but I guess my refutation is bacteria can do it, so it's not that hard.
Right. Yeah, it just takes more work to think that way. I mean, I also want to, so I pay attention to a lot of body language as well because of my communication struggles and just learning to communicate better, watching how people act and how they inflect. That to me, this led me to heavy determinism and causality, and just the fact that kids learn how to use body language faster than they learn how to talk. They'll use micro expressions and facial expressions at the level that humans will, or it's at the level that adults will, when they're very young children at the age of 3 or 4. They'll be emoting at a very high level of detail. So that also seems like it's mechanistic and materialistic. For instance, just a moment ago, you forgot the name of the person you're talking about, and you put your hand to your head. Yeah. I don't think you chose to do that, right? Like that's probably unconscious motion. I noticed this too. Every single person I talk to, when they're considering an idea, they move their eyes up and they move them to the left, to the right, or right to left, like this, as if they're considering. It's as if the eyes are literally looking up into the brain to search the problem space.
Where is it? Where is it?
That's so crazy because, I think we talked about this too. The eyes grow out of the brain in the womb. The eyes are part of the brain, and then the skull opens these holes, and then the eyes come out before you're born. And so you're literally looking at someone's brain, you're looking at their eyes. But of course, I also like to caveat that with the fact that the whole brain is the body and the whole body is the brain. Like your hands are also, like you were just saying, when you move your hand to your head or when you do inflection, like I'm not considering these hand movements as I'm doing them. It's more of a resistance to do this too much. Like I could be all over the place with my hand. That would be highly distracting. So there is some mindfulness at play there as well, I think. But there's just so much that's unconscious. The fact that people can be read, the fact that people are so predictable, like we're talking about with advertising, you can appeal to. It was Sigmund Freud's nephew that innovated a lot of advertising strategies based on what he learned from Freud's deterministic lens on psychology. And he started an advertising industry out of that. I can't remember his name, but I really don't want to. I think there's a reason I can't remember his name. So that's happening. You could say that all of our movements, like Sapolsky is a hardcore determinist, and he really sees every single movement and every single inflection and every word that comes out of your mouth as wholly determined by your past and anything that you want to call mindfulness is also causal in nature. And so again, we're back into this position where we have to make that meaningful. And I argue that you have this duty to make that meaningful. And once you start gaining more agency, then it's all meaningful anyways. Like you're running on what we would call free will, or what would be a useful form of compatibilist free will, I guess.
So I think that the analogy that I would want like the audience to take away with is my perspective. The world, the universe is not billiard balls. It's not just billiard balls, because I agree that billiard balls bumping into each other is meaningless. The way I view the world is that, yes, there's all these billiard balls, but every time they collide, they produce sparks of meaning. And so the world is not just meaningless billiard balls. The world is this constantly erupting firework of all of these billiard balls creating different types of sparks, and it cycles into these agentic structures, creating complex, detailed, intricate, and artistic types of, artistic conscious experience.
Right. I like that. I also want to say that the billiard balls are meaningful in themselves. So this is a problem with metaphors, though. Also, it literally is not billiard balls. Every time I hear a metaphor, I try to think about this now. This is a kind of revelation I had a couple years ago. But also, you absolutely need metaphors, because that's how you do art and how you do poetry. You think romantically, and you use allegory. You use like the allegory of the cave, Plato's allegory of the cave. That's extremely profound. And so the accuracy of the metaphor is what's most important. Its ability to apply to many different parts of reality. And billiards does not apply to reality very well, I think, in most situations. Fortunately so, because I don't want to reduce it like that. So I like if you don't mind, can I question your metaphor that you just gave on billiard ball?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I'll gladly adopt a better metaphor if it matches what I think is true.
Well, I don't have a better one. I just have this amazing ability to try and make the worst possible interpretation of what someone's saying. So let me try and do that.
Okay.
So one thing that stuck out to me was the sparks. Like, I really like the sparks idea, but it makes it sound like it's very random and very rare occurrences that these sparks happen. And the billiard balls are huge, but these little sparks are just tiny sparks that come off from the billiard ball, And I think when we think about meaning and we think about amazing moments of a movie that you experience, or passion and love, or when you have an insight, or when you have a really cool moment in a metal song, or like a breakdown in a metal song, those are they're like lightning bolts. But also, that's also not correct either. It's kind of like there's always connection between the billiard balls. It's this relation, I think, that's fundamental. Possibly it could be that there's just always interactions that we want to try to really respect and appreciate the potential interactions. So there's the dichotomy between the actual and the potential that's described in this, like the distinct entity and the relation, or the relata and the relation, the actual and the potential. These are words I just heard recently, and I don't know how to think about them very well, but that's apparently people use those words.
So I caught one issue. One issue is the seeming size discrepancy, which alludes to a primacy issue. You want to put the spark of consciousness as more important than the billiard ball?
I guess. Well, so I also, this is not me. I think I'm speaking from the Western paradigm or the postmodern paradigm when I say that. Like, I think most people want that to be the case, where this is why the opposition to the deterministic causality comes up, is because it's just this rare, seemingly random, or just very, very rare occurrence that these species have. And again, it's like when people say we're just these little apes with computers on our heads that happen to have landed on this tiny blue ball in the middle of this giant expanse of space, and that makes them feel small. I actually don't, my personal self, I do not relate to that. I think it's just because of the way my brain works. I try not to use that phrase often, but I think in this case this is true. When I go to zoom out to the giant expanse of the universe, there's kind of like a point that I hit. It doesn't matter to me. Like, that doesn't really matter, and also just being, it doesn't affect me negatively to think that way, I guess. And also when I think of myself as this giant operating system that's hanging out, that's trying to move around this organism with 35 trillion cells, that also doesn't overwhelm me. I like to use that though as a way of guiding myself and doing meditations. I do recitation to my cells in that way.
Yeah.
But people
Yeah.
get stressed by that.
Yeah. I mean, I have a theory of consciousness that I call energism. So like I could like talk about that a lot, but that probably is beyond the scope of this discussion. But there is like this analogy does clearly show an issue with epiphenomenalism. So in theories of consciousness, theories of mind, epiphenomenalism is the idea that consciousness is this irrelevant side effect of all of the workings of the brain. And so my analogy does convey epiphenomenalism. It's like the billiard balls, they're doing all the work, and then there's like this side effect of a spark of consciousness on the side that doesn't really do anything, not super important. I think that consciousness does play a role, so it's not like a meaningless side effect, but I do believe consciousness is a side effect of the motions of the materials. So it's simultaneously a side effect, but it like loops back into being useful, if that makes sense.
Right. And I think so the consciousness, I want to say this could be why the idealists are so drawn towards making consciousness fundamental. You see what I mean? Like we just want that to be, because it's our most important quality. Our conscious and our agency and our sense of awareness, we want to say that that's fundamental. We want that to be true because it's so precious, and we're kind of resistant / paranoid to the idea that it is this random occurrence, or that it's so it's an epiphenomena. So there's a vast philosophy describing how everything is consciousness, and also Eastern philosophy gets into that as well. But when you listen to folks like Hoffman and Kastrup and Schopenhauer talk about this, or Schopenhauer writing about it, I should say, it seems like that you can go so far with that. You can take it really far, and you can believe that, you know.
But you said something that, like, from an epistemological standpoint, right? If we're trying to like figure out what is true, like the biggest red flag is, well, we want to believe this, right? Whenever someone says we want to believe this, that's a red flag that your epistemology is corrupted. Like you're not going to get to truth if you only believe what you want to believe.
So we have to use logic and reason, not emotion. Basically.
Yeah, you have to be skeptical of that, what you want to believe. Yeah. I mean, like there's valid reasons to think consciousness is like important, but to say important equals fundamental might be an incorrect move.
Or consciousness is fundamental. I think so shout out to Kastrup, Bernardo Kastrup. He takes this entirely logical approach to this. He has 7 whole books out on this concept of idealism, analytic idealism, and he's very good at describing this. It goes beyond my conceivability. I think I've listened to probably 50 hours, maybe 100 hours of Kastrup at this point. There's still parts that I don't completely grok, but I see the logical argument, and I recognize fallacies too, and I'm like always running with a list of logical fallacies going through my head, and he very rarely commits them. If he does, he's just like, here's why I think this way, and then it kind of nullifies the logical fallacy in a way that I hadn't thought about before. And
I think Bernardo Kastrup's work completely fails because it doesn't reconcile with the science very well. So like, for example, Bernardo Kastrup, he says, well, when you have a headache, you take like medicine, you take a pill, you drink the pill, and then the pill fixes your headache. Well, we know from a scientific perspective, we know how these pills work. It's a certain shape of a molecule. There's a certain shape of a receptor. Based on these 2 shapes, it goes into the receptor and it blocks all the pain signals because it occupies that spot. Bernardo Kastrup, he wants to say, well, the pill is like this piece of consciousness, and your brain is a piece of consciousness, and the consciousnesses talk to each other and they decide no more pain. It's like that's not how it works. That's not the science of why the pill works. We know why the pill works. That's not it.
Is that what he says?
Yeah, he says weird stuff like that.
Hmm.
Because that's idealism. There's no material. It's not about the shape of the materials. It's about two conscious, like they're dissociative. Like the pill is dissociative and the brain is dissociative, and they're creating unity, and the pain goes. It's like that's not how the pain goes away. That's not how it works.
Create an association, but I can see how you can create a vast philosophy thinking that way.
Yeah.
I want to also say that if that works for you, then you should pursue it. But that's so abstract and so generalized of a statement. Like, what does it mean for something to work for you, and what does it mean to do a necessary lie or commit a necessary lie?
I would say if you're suicidally depressed, any irrational ideology, if it helps you not be suicidally depressed, go for it. Like, to me, that's the point where anything goes if you're at that level. Like, whatever helps.
Yeah, we must imagine Sisyphus happy.
Yeah.
Like, can we put it the absurdism?
Yeah.
Yeah, man. Well, I think this is probably pretty good for today. I have to dip out, but yeah, man, we'll work on this more in the future. This is a great idea.
Yeah, man. Good conversation. Really appreciate this dialectic.
Heck yeah. Yeah, very important subject.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Seth.
Yep.
Okay, let me figure out how to stop recording. Stop recording.